Hi, my name's Ian and welcome to my channel. And if you have had a wander around, especially in some of the earlier videos, you may get the idea that I'm a little bit of an archer. Now I say a little bit, I'm in no way an expert. But I want to go into that, my experience as an archer, and compare it to some role-playing games. Someone noted in comments on another video about the realism breaking the immersion of a game. So if there's something that's not quite realistic in a game, then it breaks the immersion of the game, and therefore they find it problematic. Now I don't particularly find things like that problematic because games are games, and I don't particularly expect the mice in Mousetrap to be real. I don't expect the mansion in Cluedo, or Clue to American viewers, to be an accurate mansion house with an accurate murder or anything like that. I know these are more board game abstractions of things, but really role-playing games are also abstractions. They're not meant to be simulationist. They are meant to be just fun methods of depicting fictional worlds in which you can use your brains and imaginations to walk through. Now, so given that we're going to be comparing Archery, and what I want to do, I'll go into some of the early editions and right up to current editions of Dungeons & Dragons to see what they have to say about Archery. And we'll also look at RuneQuest, we'll look at Rolemaster, we'll look at Tunnels and Trolls. But what I want to do to start this off with is give you a bit of a reading from that biblical text that is the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, my poor battered version of that, and this gives us a framework that we're working with, and why, I don't know, philosophically there seems to be a focus on the way that melee combat is depicted, and then missile combat, particularly archery, bows and things, are shoehorned into that melee scope, and not particularly very well, in my opinion. Right, so let's go and find the relevant page here. Page 61 we're on. Okay, so under combat, we're going for the third paragraph, where it describes a round, the combat round, what happens in a combat round, how long a combat round is, and the abstraction of melee combat that Dungeons & Dragons has been built on. So we have, quote, 1 minute rounds are devised to offer the maximum of choice with a minimum of complication. This allows the Dungeon Master and the players the best of both worlds. The system assumes much activity during the course of each round. Envision, if you will, a fencing, boxing or karate match. During the course of 1 minute of such a competition, there are numerous attacks which are unsuccessful, feints, manoeuvring and so forth. During a 1 minute melee round, many attacks are made, but some are mere feints, while some are blocked or parried. One, or possibly several, have a chance to actually score damage. For such chances, the dice are rolled, and if the to-hit number is equal to or exceeded, the attack was successful. But otherwise, it too was avoided, blocked, parried, or whatever. Damage scored to characters or certain monsters is actually not substantially physical, a mere nick or a scratch until the last handful of hit points is considered. It is a matter of wearing away the endurance, the luck, the magical protections. With respect to most monsters, such damage is right, blah 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 blah. So, while a round of combat is not a continuous series of attacks, it is neither just a single blow and counter-blow affair. The opponents spar and move, seeking the opportunity to engage when an opening in the enemy's guard presents itself. So that describes the abstraction of melee combat. And I think most role-playing games follow on from Dungeons & Dragons in that abstraction. It's certainly, if you look at, well, certainly the Dungeons & Dragons family, but if you look at RuneQuest and Rolemaster and so on, they're kind of built on a Dungeons & Dragons foundation, or at least were inspired by them in one way or another. then the actual what you're looking at in that abstraction is a similar kind of thing, similar length of rounds, or playing around with that, similar sort of focus on combat, not particularly being a one blow for one blow, although it is in some games. So if you apply that, or you try and apply that that kind of concept to missile fire, then it does work, except for one factor, and that factor is ammunition. So we could say that in Dungeons and Dragons, when you're shooting a bow, you are only taking advantage of those shots that you could actually make as your opponent is ducking, diving, running behind cover, and all that sort of good thing. But with ammunition, you're tying each shot to a definite attack, whether it hits or misses, because you're having to knock off ammunition. So we know for a fact that the abstract concept of a melee round, melee combat, actually comprises a number of parries, feints, and attacks, and you're only dicing for those attacks that could potentially break through your opponent's guard to wear down their combat effectiveness. That abstraction doesn't apply to missile combat, because we are specifically measuring the number of attacks that we are making, because we are knocking off ammunition for each dice roll that we make. So that's one side of it. Additionally, the idea that character, that figure, our target, is jumping backwards and forwards between different areas of cover, that is also done away with, because there are specific modifiers to missile fire combat that takes into account cover. So you can't then assume that, we're not going to make attack because they're behind cover. What you have to assume is, we can make an attack, but we're taking a penalty to hit because of cover. So there we go. We are specifically measuring the number of attacks we're making with our missile weapons because of ammunition, and the abstraction of parries, feints, and everything else doesn't apply to missile weapons, and a lot of what possibly could apply there is being encompassed within the rules and the modifiers for attacks. So let's go a little bit further then. So what we need to know to compare all of these games to real life, right? We need to pin it down to a common measurement of whether these bows are being depicted in at least a semblance of realism there. Now, what I'm not going to do is get into things like accuracy and range and so on, because if you're shooting bows at long range, obviously your accuracy goes down, and that's measured in rules with modifiers for the range of bows. And I know some of the ranges that are listed for bows in a lot of games are completely out of whack with the reality of sort of things. I mean, the competitions that I shoot in, we're shooting up to 70 yards, so which is well within the ranges that are depicted for bows. But what I'm going to assume is that for the purposes of this, accuracy is a sort of vague notion, right? So we're not talking about shooting at chinks in armor or tiny sort of chunks in that. We're shooting at a body mass shots, body mass target. And what I've done is I've chosen 30 yards, because I think at 30 yards I certainly can be accurate in a target that's that size over 30 yards, and I think the modifiers and everything else, they sort of even themselves out. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down each of the games, and we're going to see or pin everything down. Each game we're going to pin it down to what is its shot rate per minute, number of arrows per minute. So a few assumptions that we're going to make before we go into this is going into the round, and this is more important for some games than others, but going into the round we are going to assume that the archer is has a bow already nocked. Right. We're also going to assume a short bow, or in other games it would be a composite bow or whatever you call it. But we're largely a recurve composite short bow. Okay, so that's whatever each individual game decides to label that as. Main reason being is that's the primary bow that I shoot with. So therefore, the practical example that we're going to be measuring and comparing all of these things with, that's what it was shot by. So let's try and do at least a semblance of a like for like, right? But we'll do that at the end once we've calculated all of these things for the various different games. And I'll break down, I mean, for Dungeons and Dragons it's simple, but then there's things like Rolemaster, which uses a percentage of activity, and RuneQuest, which uses strike ranks. So it's each of those games is slightly different to just saying there is a set rate of shot rate of fire, right? The point of contention within traditional archers, you don't fire a bow. There is no fire, explosion, or anything like that involved. You shoot a bow. But anyway, that's me just being old and fuddy-duddy and traditionalist. So shot rate, and we're going to pin everything down with all the calculations that we're going to do to a shot rate per minute, and from there we'll see how all of the shot rates match up per game, and then at the end of it we'll compare it to reality. I'll also to inexpert reality. Let's put that down there as well. In no way do I consider myself an expert archer. I am a fairly competent archer, and I'm a traditional archer. So none of the practical illustrations involve anything like counterweights or sights or anything like that. Just a stick and a string. Okay, a modern material stick and string, but it's comparable to the bows that we're talking about within the games. All right, so all of that being said, let's get into it. I will see you in a bit, but we'll go to some weird screen where I can blackboard numbers onto the thing for you, so you can we can pretend it's school. How's that? Yeah. Catch you later. Okay, so welcome to the archery classroom. To what we're going to look at. Okay, so let's take game by game and see where we get to. Some of the games that we're going to be talking about, especially in Dungeons and Dragons editions, have very similar, so we'll lump them all together. We'll start with original Dungeons and Dragons. The very start of it, 1974. Only one attack was assumed at that point. And a round in that game was 60 seconds. So we have our shot per minute. That's what we're looking at. So for original Dungeons and Dragons, we are looking at one shot per 60 seconds, one shot per minute. So one arrow per minute. All right, so let's move on to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition, and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition, and Osric and other retro clone games or whatever that are based on First and Second Edition. In those games, we're looking at a shot rate of 2 arrows per round, and the rounds are, as we read out earlier, 60 seconds long. So that gives us a easy calculation of 2 arrows per minute. For basic Dungeons and Dragons, that's the BECMI range of things, or the BX. Pretty much, it's the same. For what we're talking about, it's the same numbers. So in that case, there was 1 attack per round. Oh, and also I'm not including the weapon mastery rules from there. Similarly, I'm not including weapon specialization or any of those things. And when we get into some of the later editions, I'm also not including things like extended base attack bonus for 3rd edition. I'm not including feats that will improve your rate of fire or anything like that. Because you know, like I said, I'm not an expert archer, so I don't have any of those things, so I'm not going to add them into the comparison. Here we go. Right, so basic Dungeons and Dragons. 1 shot per attack, so a rate of shot rate of 1 attack per a round of 10 seconds. So that's one shot every 10 seconds. That gives us 6 arrows per minute. So its shot rate, 6 arrows per minute. Now when we look at Dungeons & Dragons editions 3, 4 and 5, they all use 6-second rounds. And they also assume one attack per round. Again, just reiterating, no quick shot, no extended base attack bonus, none of that. Just one attack per round. Let's, if you want, let's just assume a 2nd or 3rd level character or whatever you want to do. So we're looking at one shot per 6 seconds, 6-second rounds. So that gives us an arrows per minute rate of 10. So 10 arrows per minute. So you can already see that by playing around with these values and looking at the and actually breaking down what they appear to mean for all the reasons that we've given, there's already a huge difference between the shot rate of the original version, the older versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and the more modern ones. So Swords and Wizardry, let's look at that. So Swords and Wizardry is meant to be a retro clone of the original Dungeons and Dragons, but it has a slightly different way of looking at the rate of fire and so on. So in Swords and Wizardry, the rate of fire, the shot rate, whatever, shots per round for a short bow, it's 3, and the rounds are, like those early versions of Dungeons & Dragons, is 60 seconds. So with Swords and Wizardry, a modified retro clone of the older editions of Dungeons & Dragons, we end up with a shot rate of 3. So for RuneQuest, the number of attacks that you can make is based on your strike rank for a bow. Based on that, and also the assumption that RuneQuest makes that a bow takes 5 strike ranks to reload, and that there are 12 strike ranks in a round, and a round comprises 12 seconds. Okay, so in this case, I'm assuming a character with a strike rank of 3, which is reasonably average, and as I said, a strike rank of 5 to reload. So the first shot will come on strike rank 3, then 5 strike ranks to reload. That will bring us up to strike rank of 8, and then plus a further 3 strike ranks for the second shot. So that will bring us up to strike rank 11, and there being no further time in order to make a third shot. So that brings us up to 2 attacks are possible with a bow in the space of 12 seconds, that 12-second round based on strike rank. That gives us a shots per minute of 10 shots per minute. Now with Rolemaster, and remember we're talking about RMSS or RMFRP, we are looking at a 60% reload time and a 60% attack time. However, that 60% attack time can also be reduced down to 30% by taking a penalty, and the penalty is based on whatever percentage of activity that you are using to attack by minus that 60% generally required. So what I'm going to do with Rolemaster is assume that we're using 100% activity in order to do our reload and attack, or our attack and reload, which regardless which way around it, I'm assuming that we are summing it up to 100%. So with this, we're assuming a 40% attack, 40% activity to attack, 60% activity to reload, and we're taking a minus 20 on our offensive bonus in order to get that attack and reload done in one round. So just bear in mind that the numbers for Rolemaster, we are assuming an accuracy penalty in order to shoot reasonably quickly to get that reload and shot in at in the same round. Now the number of seconds per round used by Rolemaster is 10. So there we are looking at 1 shot per 10 seconds, and so therefore an arrows per minute rate of 6. Right? Tunnels and Trolls, it gets a little bit difficult, because with Tunnels and Trolls it's very abstract, and it assumes a round of from 10 seconds to 2 minutes. That means that rates of fire are all over the place, and the rate of fire isn't. You get one attack with your one attack with whatever weapon per round, because there's all sorts of. I mean, it's even more abstract than Dungeons and Dragons. So we're assuming one attack per round, and that could be one attack within 10 seconds, or it could be one attack within 120 minutes, or anywhere in seconds, 120 seconds, not 120 minutes, or anywhere in between. So for these, let's take a Tunnels and Trolls high, and we'll assume one attack per 10 seconds. That gives us a shots per minute of 6. And the low Tunnels and Trolls value would be one attack per 120 seconds, which it's less than 1, but we're going to round that up to 1, because half an attack per round makes no sense whatsoever. So we'll say that Tunnels and Trolls ranges between 1 shot per round to 6 shots per round. Okay, so just to summarise all of that, so for original Dungeons and Dragons, it's 1 shot per minute. For first and second and Osric, it's 2 shots per minute. For Swords and Wizardry, it's 3 shots per minute. For Rolemaster Standard System and Tunnels and Trolls at the low end, it is 6 shots per minute. And for 3rd, 4th and 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and for RuneQuest in Adventures in Glorantha, it is 10 shots per minute. So they're all our calculated values from the length of round, or length of combat period, whatever you want to call it, for each of those games based on the rate of fire, whatever, for a short bow, the statistics for a short bow given in all of those. Okay, so let's just pause for a second while you have a little bit of a look at me. Well, you don't look at me, you'll see a target. Okay, so this target is 30 yards away, so we're looking at me shooting at a target with a traditional recurve bow from a distance of 30 yards, and I'll put a stopwatch on it. And now the stopwatch will start when the first arrow connects to the target, and we'll finish it at when the last arrow connects to the target. And I think that's a fair way of measuring it, right? So the stopwatch starts on arrow number 1 striking the target, and stopwatch ends on arrow 6 striking the target, and we'll see what kind of rate of fire, rate of shot, whatever that gives us. Okay? So next, just as an aside to all of this, and before we go into the sort of final wrap-up analysis about what all of this means, there was an article published in 1982 in Dragon issue 58 by a chap called Robert Barrow that tried to delve into realism in archery. Now, Robert does go into a bit on the rate of fire. So I'm just going to read a little passage out from the back end of this. So the arrow during a melee round. There we go. In almost every combat situation, reading from the article that is, an arrow either hits or misses before the melee turn or combat is completed. Okay, that's the description of. And remember, this is referring back to the original Dungeons and Dragons. A melee turn in the D&D rules lasts 10 seconds, as we've discussed earlier. An arrow only stays in the air for 8 or 9 seconds at best. Well, that's yeah, that sort of depends on range, and it depends on what sort of bow you're using, and so on. I would suggest that 8 or 9 seconds is that's a long time for an arrow to be in here. But however, the arrow travels so fast, between 120 and 200 feet per second. Yes, that's fair, and possibly even faster. Well, I mean, yeah. And the flight of an arrow aimed along a fairly flat trajectory at a target is typically not very far away, does not consume measurable time. No, absolutely. And you saw that from the video. And if you listen carefully to the video, you can actually hear the sound of an arrow clicking its nock onto the string before I actually shoot the arrow, and it obviously hits the target. So if you ever want to do some timing between those two, the faint click of the camera picked up on the arrow being knocked and it finally arriving at the target, and want to do all of that over 30 yards, then you knock yourselves out. So where do we get to? The flight of an arrow aimed along a fairly flat trajectory at a target typically not very far away, and so 30 yards is not that far away, does not consume measurable time, as we can see. A trained English longbowman could fire an arrow, right, could shoot an arrow about once every 3 seconds, and possibly even faster than that. But once every 3 seconds is about right, and if you ever get a chance to go and see medieval reenacting archers, one of the things that they will demonstrate is actually rate of fire. Now the rate of fire is only meaningful if it's an accurate rate of fire. So if you're just going launching arrows up into the air willy-nilly, then yeah, you can get some pretty good things. But I mean, it doesn't matter where the arrows go, you're just launching a whole bunch of arrows in. But that's not the point. The point is those arrows have got to be accurate, because comparing back to games and things like that, the assumption is because you're making a die roll in order to see if you hit, then you're actually trying to be accurate with those. So it has to be a rate of fire for accurate shots. Now, 1 arrow per 3 seconds, that's well within the bounds of reality for a trained archer with accurate shots. All of these arrows would arrive during the turn or the round in which they were shot. The sole exception would be the third arrow, which would be fired at a very long range target. Yeah. So remember, we're talking about 30-second rounds here, and 10-second rounds here. So 1 arrow every 3 seconds. So you're talking about a rate of fire of 3. Rate of shots of 3 per round, which is what Swords and Wizardry do in their assumptions there. So they have Swords and Wizardry has it uses minute rounds, but it has a rate of fire of 3, which is 1 arrow every 12 seconds, or 3 arrows per minute. So yes, trained English longbowman could fire an arrow about once every 3 seconds, possibly even faster. And the rate is some 3 shots per melee round, and you get a melee round of 10 seconds. So yeah, so that's kind of what someone from back in 1982 was trying to write also about. They didn't address that, they just had a statement towards the end of the article about we've discussed all of these things about range, and now we're talking about rate of fire, but they don't do anything. Robert states rates of fire, doesn't put forward any practical resolutions to the game's inaccuracy in that regard. The article's actually interesting because it bases the size of the target you're trying to shoot at and against the range that you are shooting at it from, which in later editions of Dungeons and Dragons, you obviously got that modifier to armor class for your size, so it's probably a simpler way of doing it. Right, Okay, enough of all of this maths and chalkboard type stuff. Let's go and sum up what we've learned. Okay, so what have we learned with all of that messing around with numbers and everything else? Well, quite simply is that the shot rate of that is assumed in role-playing games is largely wildly out, especially for early games. Within modern games or the latest iteration of games from back in the day, so we're looking at RuneQuest, the latest version of RuneQuest, RuneQuest Adventures in Glorantha, and 3rd, 4th and 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the shot rate is actually reasonable. And then when you throw in the potential for modifying those shot rates with expertise, and in Dungeons and Dragons with feats that will allow you to up your rate of fire, with rate of shots, rate of attack, with in 3rd edition with your base attack bonus going up as you gain levels and that side of things, then yeah, your expertise is going to increase your rate of fire, and those numbers are going to get even better. So from that perspective, the issue that existed back in the day when I came to role playing games before I came to Archery, but back in the day when I was playing role playing games, and I didn't know any better, that Dungeons and Dragons, the actual shot rate of advanced Dungeons and Dragons was horrendously out, until I actually picked up a bow and started shooting bows when I was a teenager. And then you came to the realization that with a little bit of practice, an inexpert archer can actually hit a human-sized target from a reasonable distance away at a reasonable shot rate that far exceeds the shot rate that's described in those early games. So, does it matter? No, not really. I mean, a lot of the downplaying of these things is going to be for game balance and that side of things. I mean, if you up the shot rate and so on of bows so that more accurate in those early games, you'll probably be wrecking a lot of the game balance. However, bows, missile weapons could be absolutely devastating on a field of battle. If you've got a bunch of people, in fact, some medieval battles are quite famous for being won by the presence of bows on the field. Mobile archer warriors, whatever you want to call them, like the Mongols and stuff, they made huge use of horse archery, of bows on horseback and archers on foot. Many armies throughout history, prior to the invention of firearms, used archers en masse with high rates of fire, high shot rates, in order to rain down death and devastation on their enemies. It is a bow in the right hands is a devastating weapon. But in game terms, in especially those early editions of Dungeons and Dragons, it's not. It's barely any better than a short sword in the span of a round. And if the abstraction, where the abstraction states that if you're fighting with that short sword, that one attack that you get with your short sword is actually representative of that time that you manage to break through your opponent's defences and potentially get a score on them that will diminish their combat expertise, then that short sword wielder is actually doing a lot of stuff, parrying maybe a few attacks that are just being parried. So the number of actual attacks that the short sword person is using within that abstracted out 1 minute round is far in excess of the number of attacks that our bowman is getting However, the bowman's attacks are being specifically tied to ammunition, so they are actually representative. The dice rolls are representative of actual attacks. So the weapon isn't as devastating as it really should be, and is depicted in historical records. Now, modern games, 3rd, 4th, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and RuneQuest and Glorantha, those four especially, much better. Shot rates that are in the realms of reality, and therefore those weapons can be absolutely devastating in combat. And it's not, from a gaming point of view, it's not that important. If from a historical realism point of view, if you want to go down that line, it is very important. If you want to try and, if you have a culture, for example, I mean, I'm English, we have a whole culture of archery for various reasons from our history and so on. If you want to depict a culture that does have a place and import on bows accurately in 1st and 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, there is no reason for any culture to have any focus on a bow whatsoever. It's not a particularly good weapon. Yes, it's a ranged weapon, doesn't do that much damage. Whoop-de-doo. If it was depicted accurately, it would be very much, definitely a bow that a weapon that a culture could build a whole cult around. So there you go. My thoughts on realism and archery with a focus on shot rate. And if you want to look at that Dragon magazine article, it's very interesting. But like I said, it delves more into ranges and accuracy against targets of different sizes, dependent on the range you're shooting at. But it's an interesting article nonetheless. So that's going to wrap it up for today. It is something that is something I've not worried about over the years, but it has been something that I've found a bit laughable. It's not ruined my enjoyment of the games. It's not been something that's destroyed the element of immersion, especially not in a fantasy game. I mean, if anything, a dragonborn or an elf or a dwarf or a lizard man or something like that, those are the things that I find that for those overly fantastic elements of things, they sort of break the immersion for me, but not in a bad way. You can go from the immersion into a fantasy mode, suspension of disbelief and that sort of thing, quite happily, and I can deal with the odd rates of shot that the missile weapons are depicted as in those games in exactly the same way. It doesn't particularly matter to me. I'm not going to think about anything that hard. Well, I mean, I just have done, but other than that, it has been. It's one of those things I found amusing, but it's not ruined those games for me. So, thought I would just touch on that subject for you. So, until the next time that we meet, probably another episode of View Over the Milieu, I will leave it a surprise over which one is coming next. And until then, take care of each other, have a good weekend, and the rest of the week, and so on. Till next time.